Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Menopause 101. Today's topic is perimenopause. Perimenopause just means around the menopause, and it refers to that period of time when a woman's hormonal function or ovarian function is beginning to transition between having regular cycles that are characteristic of somebody that's younger and having the final menstrual period in the later part of life that we call menopause. For most women who have symptoms that are significantly related to these transition periods in their hormonal life cycle, the perimenopause is typically the most troublesome. And there's some reasons for that we'll talk about today. So to begin with, I'm going to use this graph to talk about quite a few of the changes. This comes from a really important study from 1996 by Nanette Santoro. At that time, we didn't know very much about what happened during the perimenopausal transition. So I want to start with just how we think about just normal function, normal communication between the brain and the ovaries. So we're going to talk about three different hormones: follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. E1 is just going to stand for estrogen. It means estrone, which was what was measured in urine, and then a metabolite of progesterone that will be used to represent what happens with progesterone. So to start the menstrual cycle off, and this graph's a little bit confusing perhaps in some ways, if you look down at the bottom here, day 0 is ovulation. So this is the period in the beginning of the cycle that's leading up to ovulation. And we'll go back up to follicle stimulating hormone. You can see that there's two groups of women that are represented in this graph. The first is, they're called normal. Let's think of them as just younger women who have regular cycles. So we can see that follicle stimulating hormone, which is what recruits the follicle or the egg that's going to be released each cycle. Follicle stimulating hormone is what allows or causes the egg to mature. So in younger women, we see it kind of running along here, and then a little bit of a spike right around ovulation, and then it returns down to a low level until the next cycle. So one of the first things that we notice is that in women around perimenopause, follicle stimulating hormones throughout the cycle on average are a lot higher, and the difference, these are called error bars, the difference between, or the size or the length of these bars indicates how much variability there is. So you can see that there's very little variability in women who are regular, normally cycling younger women. And around perimenopause, these levels get much higher. Why is that? Think of the ovary as a worker who went to work at age 12 and works 24/7 for its entire lifetime. When it gets to be around the age, generally in the early 40s, it's getting tired of working. And so it becomes more resistant to working. Follicle stimulating hormone, along with another pituitary hormone called luteinizing hormone, are what causes, it's the director, think of it as the supervisor of the boss of the ovaries. As the ovaries get a little tired, the brain has to put out a stronger message. I like to refer to as, instead of talking to the ovaries on a monthly basis, they have to shout at the ovaries. So we can see that lots more stimulation is needed. And then when we consider luteinizing hormone, and luteinizing hormone shows a very sharp spike at just one point during the month around ovulation. So luteinizing hormone is what causes the ovary to kick out that developed follicle. So not only is follicle stimulating hormone higher in women who are in perimenopause, but you can see that the peak of luteinizing hormone is as well. But what happens with all that excessive stimulation of the ovary is that the estrogen levels are actually higher throughout the cycle than they are in a normal cycling woman. A lot of people think, oh, perimenopause is my estrogen is low. Actually, perimenopause has the highest estrogen levels that a woman will experience outside of pregnancy. That's in the beginning of perimenopause, which is typically a period of maybe 3 to 5 years. Later in perimenopause, these hormone levels begin to fall, and then when we get into menopause, this becomes just a flat line because the ovaries have got their watch, they got their final retirement party, and they're done. Let's now shift. We've kind of talked about how estrogen levels are higher, but progesterone, what's happening with progesterone? Instead of this is kind of reverse of what we saw before, these normally cycling younger women, they have higher progesterone during ovulation, and we can see that perimenopausal women have lower estrogen on average, not estrogen, progesterone. So this is one of the early changes that occurs within the perimenopause, is that progesterone levels decline. We call that luteal phase, which is the second half of the cycle, luteal phase insufficiency. This can be responsible, actually these two together, these very large fluctuating levels of estrogen combined with a relative decrease in progesterone can result in irregularities in bleeding. Now, one of the take-home points, aside from the hormonal changes, is to talk a little bit about hormone testing. I'll give you the bottom line up front, which is myself and most of the colleagues that I know and the experts in the field would say that there's very little place for hormonal testing during this period of time. Why is that the case? Think of a friend of yours that goes to Six Flags and takes a ride on a roller coaster. You don't know what roller coasters are, you've never seen one before. So you say, well, take a picture of that so I can see what a roller coaster is like. Well, it depends on what part of the roller coaster you take a picture. If your friend takes a picture when they're going up versus on a flat versus on one of those steep drops, you're going to get a different answer. It's very difficult. The women in this study were very courageous. I don't know the number of women, but what they did was they collected their urine for 6 months every day in order to get this data. That's just not practical, and it really doesn't help in the diagnosis. What you really want to know is what's the story, what's going on. Why is this tricky? It's tricky because in the beginning part of perimenopause, changes in menstrual patterns may be very subtle or they may not be present at all, and yet hormonal changes are going on in the background. Well, the reproductive tissues are not the only part of the human body, part of a woman's body that is responsive to hormones, especially estrogen. And in fact, what we really want to think about and what bothers most women is the effects of those hormones in the brain. So as a sort of general principle, the central nervous system, or the brain, if you will, likes stability in particularly in the amount of estrogen that's around and available. Many women who have been pregnant will tell you that in the first couple of months of pregnancy, they felt better than they have in their life. Women who have migraines, their migraines tend to stabilize because hormone levels are high and hormone levels are very stable through the end of pregnancy. So it can be very tricky when you don't have some indications from menstrual patterns changing that your hormones have started to change. And unfortunately, some women get dismissed from their clinicians, physicians, nurse practitioners, PAs, what have you. When they bring these types of perimenopausal symptoms, especially mood changes and sleep changes, to their medical provider, and they say, well, it can't be perimenopause because you're still cycling normally. That's just not the case. Later in perimenopause, when women start having missed cycles long periods between cycles, and it becomes fairly obvious, something's beginning to change, I'm headed toward perimenopause. It's fairly obvious. In early perimenopause, not so much. What do you do about these kinds of problems? Well, I'm going to go back to the graph for a minute. Okay. So, do we want to supplement estrogen? Not necessarily, in fact, not usually. And the reason is, again, in early perimenopause, the estrogen levels are already high. So if we add additional estrogen, that doesn't really help anything. Now, one sort of special population that may do well with estrogen used during discrete parts of the cycle are women with migraine, because some women who have what we would call hormonally sensitive migraine, and that's women who have migraines that are very bad and fairly predictable right before their menstrual period or around ovulation, less commonly. They don't do well with all these ups and downs, this high amount of variability in estrogen from one day to the next. They prefer to have a stable estrogen environment. So sometimes what we might do is give them a little bit of estrogen toward the end of the cycle, because the major thing that causes migraines is it's not estrogen deficiency. It's when you go from high estrogen to low estrogen rather suddenly. And you can blunt that with the use of an estrogen patch. So some of the things that can be done, we already said that although estrogen's high, progesterone is low. So progesterone can be supplemented in this part of the cycle, particularly if there is an increase in the amount of bleeding. But my favorite thing, and what is the most elegant solution to a lot of this chaos, if you will, is to take the whole system kind of offline. How do you do that? Well, one way to do that is birth control pills. Birth control pills take these brain hormones out of the equation, and by inhibiting the production of these brain controlling hormones, eventually the ovaries quiet down, and what we see is that the estrogen kind of evens out because the ovaries are suppressed. They're not making the fluctuating amounts of estrogen and progesterone anymore, but the pill provides a constant amount of estrogen on a day-to-day basis. I don't want you to think that the only solutions to perimenopausal symptoms are hormones. Lifestyle factors, what you eat, the amount of exercise that you do, and generally the way that you live, alcohol consumption, the amount of sleep that you get, all influence, along with your own genetics, how you will experience the perimenopausal transition. There's also a lot of variability in the time that perimenopause can begin. It may be as early as the mid-30s, and in other women, it may not start until the 50s. It can be slow over a period of up to about 8 years, or the perimenopausal transition, particularly if it occurs later in time, may only occur over a period of 2 to 3 years. The hormonal changes, subtle as they may be present before that time. I hope you found this information helpful. If there are other topics related to menopause and perimenopause that you would like to have some information about, please leave me comments in the section below. Thank you.